Hey everyone, we made it through the year. Happy 2025, and thanks for hanging around with me for another year of reading. As is tradition for me at this point, I'm going to go through the year and review my favorite books I read over the past year. And this year, unlike some of the past years, I don't really have a single favorite book. So I'm just going to present these books in a mostly arbitrary order, just talking a bit about why each one stood out to me. Many of these, of course, have by this point been featured in individual dedicated reviews on my channel, so be sure to check out my archive if you're interested in learning more about any of them. Here, I'll just be giving you a bit of a taste about what I liked about each one of them. So, getting started, I read a few books from Niall Marsh's Roderick Allen mystery series this year, and the one of those that stood out to me the most was the second book in the series, Enter a Murderer. This mystery, focusing on a supposed accident that occurs on stage during a theatrical performance, is one that delightfully blends your typical whodunit murder investigation with an interesting setting that allows for some unique possibilities. And more than any of the other Niall Marsh mysteries I read this year, in this one the clues and the overall mystery really stand up and do impress by the end of the play, or by the end of the novel. Another one I read at the very start of the year that really surprised me was Marple, 12 New Mysteries, a set of short stories by an assortment of contemporary women authors. I meant to do a full video for this one at some point, and actually I have collected my thoughts for that now. I just need to record it still, but I am looking forward to completing this review. By and large, though, I was happy to go back to these stories because I really enjoyed what the authors brought us in this collection. It's not without a few duds, but I think the most successful authors here managed to really capture and develop the essence of Miss Marple's character in a way that managed somehow to appeal to the interests and sensibilities of modern readers, but without feeling anachronistic or completely repainting the character in a way that just doesn't feel like Miss Marple anymore. In fact, yeah, just talking about this one right now is already getting me excited to film that review and finish that one up because I think it's going to be an interesting one. The most memorable mystery for me this year was unsurprisingly Curtain, Hercule Poirot's Last Case by Agatha Christie. I mean, how can you not remember a case like this one, which is not only an exciting suspenseful mystery with some great twists, but also a farewell from Agatha Christie to her readers, a novel that goes far beyond what I think the typical mystery novel or even Agatha Christie novel achieves. This is one where it's really going to be enjoyable for people who have already read the rest of the Poirot series, or at least are through many of the classics. So I don't really have much more to say about this one here, other than that it is a satisfying and very rewarding final installment to the Poirot reading journey. I did take on some nonfiction history this year as well, and one memorable book was this monster of a book I finished this year, but actually began in the middle of last year. And that book was The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, which also led to a monster YouTube discussion of this book if you're interested in taking a deep dive there. As it turned out, I think that's the longest dedicated review video I've ever posted for true fans or enthusiasts of history only. In brief, though, Shirer, just 15 years out from the end of the Second World War at the time, recounts the full story of what happened in Germany, albeit from an American journalist's point of view, one who was stationed in the Reich for much of that time that the war was taking place. It's a fascinating look into many different dimensions of how the Nazis rose to power, took over much of Europe, and then were finally thwarted at massive human cost, of course. It's massive, it's detail-oriented, and it's certainly not light reading in size or in content. It's also certainly an American's view of the situation, one that has been challenged in various aspects over the 60 plus years following its publication, but it's still an excellent and engaging account for those who want to know the full political story, and it's one of the most well-recognized historical nonfiction books of all time. On the topic of political stories, another nonfiction book I listened to towards the very end of last year and really enjoyed was Tim Alberta's American Carnage on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. I know that title is quite a handful, and I would also argue fairly sensational in its casting of this drama, but I found this quite an insightful book that looks at the progression of the U.S. Republican Party in the 10-ish years from the end of George W. Bush's presidency to the middle of Trump's first term. The author is one of those seemingly rarer, more centrist figures who is clearly no fan of Trump and his new politics, but also who has a considerable amount of respect for the older version of the Republican Party as he sees it, though without failing to point out and criticize its mistakes as well. This is the kind of book that I think, for the most part, caters to readers with more centrist political views who are ready to take each event each activity as just what it is, rather than immediately typecasting the Republicans or the Democrats. And because of this, I do think there are a lot of readers on the outer wings of the political spectrum who might not enjoy it, but also a lot of people like me who will find it enormously refreshing. At the end of the day, though, this book is a book centered on the political dramas of the Republican Party, one that casts the party and its central figures like John Boehner and Paul Ryan as these sort of tragic heroes who, regardless of readers' opinion of their exact political beliefs, were fighting to protect a conception of their party that was falling by the wayside. And this decline was all accompanied by and related to the rising popularity of more populist Republicans who first called themselves the Tea Party and paved the way for Trumpism. Of course, I read this book with an awareness that this really is only the first part of an incomplete story, particularly since a week after I finished this book, Trump won his re-election to a second term. Still, while the story never really comes to a natural conclusion, one minor weakness of the book overall, I found it quite helpful in reviewing how we got to where we are right now. If you're a big Trump fan, you probably are not going to enjoy it because the author's attitudes towards Trump are pretty clear, but overall an engaging and entertaining read if you enjoy political dramas, that is. Okay, these next two books are interesting because they are classics and I liked them, but also I didn't necessarily like either of them in the moment just quite as much as I thought I might have. Yet they're certainly very memorable, and they both feel rich, as if there is much more in them than I was able to grasp on my first read through. The first of those is Charlotte Bronte's classic novel, Jane Eyre, and it was about time I read this one. I'm not going to say much more about it here because I already discussed it in its own video and on one of my Friday Reads videos as well, so I'll just say that I enjoyed jumping into Jane's world and that Jane as a character really carried the whole story for me in a way that made the whole thing certainly worthwhile. And I certainly enjoyed jumping just for a bit into that world of analysis and criticism of this novel afterwards, though I know I really only scraped the surface of what's out there. Also, though, this just feels like one of those novels where you want to have read it because it comes up so often in references from other works and discussions and even YouTube videos that I already anticipate it's going to open up new doors for me in understanding and comparing with other great works of literature. And then there was the big one, Tolstoy's War and Peace. This one is such a massive book, one that, for me, I will admit by the end had worn me down just a little bit so that maybe I was not quite so complimentary of it in my first assessments of it and comments to others. I knew going in that this book would interweave the stories of many main characters, but what I hadn't imagined was just how much it would interweave the stories of many non-main characters. I mean, there are characters that disappear for 500 pages before we see them again. There are main characters that disappear for hundreds of pages before we see them again. And I also didn't expect the extent to which Tolstoy himself would be sort of a character in this book, inserting himself into the narrative to make his own opinions known in a way that is not subtle, nor does it try to be. Because of all this, I still find I really fail to fully grasp the novel or even its themes as a whole, because maybe it will cohere more solidly in some way, like once I've watched the 20-episode BBC 1972 series, of which I've currently just completed, I think, 1 or 2 episodes. And yet there were so many scenes or passages in this novel that were very moving for me. Some of them are probably general audience favorites, but I think some of the ones that moved me the most were the ones where there's just an unexpectedly touching encounter or exchange in the midst of something that on the surface feels very mundane. There are unexpected and sometimes inexplicable moments of seeing things clearly, or at least seeing things in a different way, that occur in the most unremarkable of moments, and this is a novel that encourages the reader to always be on the lookout for them. Not that life is all about seeking out sublime moments either, but it seems that Tolstoy at least acknowledges that these moments can come in a whole variety of different scenarios. And one more classic I quite enjoyed was Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. Part of why I enjoyed it is that, aside from being my first longer Hemingway work after The Old Man and the Sea last year, it's one where I felt there really was something to it the whole time, but where it also was frustrating and evasive at times, and hard to put my finger on what I liked about it or what truths it accurately portrayed. And these are questions that I still haven't fully answered, although spending some time after I completed the novel listening to the Close Reads podcast crew discuss it, that certainly enhanced the overall experience for me and cemented it in my mind as a novel that's excellent in an unusual way, and one that may be worth a second read at some point. Of course, Hemingway's style of telling a story can be challenging, so this is apparently a rather polarizing work, but For me, although the story itself remained rather elusive to the end, the way he narrated this novel in particular was crisp and captivating in a way that I found extremely engaging and accessible whenever I was able to just withhold analyzing it all for at least a little bit. I also loved one work that was based on a classic that I read this year, and that was Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres, based off of Shakespeare's play King Lear. I think this is already a solid novel standing alone, but my familiarity with the play King Lear really enhanced the experience for me, and it was so fun to go back and re explore King Lear and see how its themes were further developed or portrayed in this modern adaptation. Briefly, Smiley's retelling is set in, I believe, the 1980s, definitely in the later 20th century, and tells the story of an Iowa farmer, a controlling but seemingly beneficent father who decides to divide up his land among his daughters. The real kicker here, though, is that if you're familiar with the original King Lear, the main character in A Thousand Acres is not the good daughter Cordelia, but rather one of the would-be evil daughters, Goneril, here renamed as Ginny. I had such a great time with this novel, and I'm already feeling strangely nostalgic thinking back to the spring in which I read this one. Another novel that I really enjoyed reading in the spring was Alice McDermott's story, Absolution, which I believe came out in 2023. It's the tale of American wives accompanying their corporate husbands as helpmeets as they head off to somehow support U.S. intelligence forces during the Vietnam War. Exactly what the husbands do is pretty irrelevant to this story, as the focus is squarely placed upon these women and their internal struggles as they try to do good for the people of Vietnam. One thing I really like about this book, thinking back to it, is the subtle and successful way in which it's told. The women act and feel like fundamentally good hearted people who also espouse some stereotypes and misconceptions that women like them, or other Americans like them in general, would have held at the time. They want to be good people, they try so hard to be good people, and yet, even by the end of the story, the author never really gives them that satisfaction. At least never gives our narrator, Tricia, that satisfaction of knowing she is a good person. The world is a complicated place. We do our best in it, and sometimes it's hard to know what's right or if there is a right or wrong choice. And some of that is simply because of our own limitations of information or of awareness, limitations that are impossible to overcome. And we somehow have to accept that we cannot rid ourselves of guilt, all while still striving to do good in the world as we see it. And maybe more, to continue striving for the wisdom to even know and see what good is. And I really want to emphasize here that this is my own take on the novel. I'm not saying it because the author spells it all out for us by the end. This is a novel in which I think different readers will see a lot of different things. And this is evidenced by the fact that most of the others I read this with weren't sure, even by the end, what to make of its title, Absolution, or why it was called that. Still, I personally take the title as one of the few direct clues that the author herself also sees this theme I was just talking about as one of, if not the most important dimension of the novel. These women are characters who want to be good, who are seeking absolution through good works, which is a word with clear religious undertones, as these characters themselves are, I believe, all Catholics. And yet, at least in my reading of the novel, that absolution is not really fully attainable for them in the way that they want it to be. And yet, somehow, it is still a noble goal to aspire to if done the right way. I sort of regret that I never got around to doing a dedicated review video on this book, because talking about it right now is also really reminding me just how much I enjoyed it at the time. Would definitely recommend it. One other great novel this year with a totally different vibe was Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, the story of a not that famous actress living in Hollywood whose fame continues to decline as she navigates challenges of an unexpected pregnancy, marital problems, societal pressures to look amazing even as she ages, and as well as personal struggles like crippling anxiety and substance abuse. In the central character Mariah's rather wretched state, we see someone who, yeah, may have made some mistakes to get to where she is now, yet we can't help feeling that these were not the biggest possible mistakes, certainly not mistakes deserving such punishment as the lows she has now reached. Fundamentally, I and many readers still admire her as a character, and yet find ourselves frustrated by her inability to change her future, and with a state of resigned acceptance that she has about her situation by the time the novel has begun. Obviously, based on this description, it's not going to be for everyone, and yet I personally feel there's a lot here for you if you're someone who can sit with a bleak novel like this. It's also a fast and compelling read, one that I completed in just a few nights of reading. Finally, there's Sally Rooney's new novel of the year, Intermezzo, and yes, I did really enjoy this one as well. I've done a separate review on this one, which I don't think I'll have posted yet at the time, but which is edited and ready to go and will be coming soon. So I'll just give a very high-level overview here. Intermezzo, of all the Sally Rooney novels I've read, is one of her strongest, if not her strongest yet. And while I feel that at this point you know what you're getting when you pick up a Sally Rooney novel, you also don't know exactly what you're getting, and this one felt fresh enough to make it really delightful and really moving, in fact, for me. The novel follows the interwoven stories of two brothers spaced about 10 years apart in age, and their more than two love interests, all as the brothers grieve the recent loss of their father to cancer and struggle with their own uncertainties about what matters to them in life. In that regard, they're much like any Sally Rooney characters. And while the romantic encounters and dynamics, as always, will be enough to captivate many readers, including myself, I found the real gem in the novel is the tense relationship between the two brothers who used to be very close but have fallen apart due to their apparently incompatible personalities. Intermezzo, definitely worth a read, and I say this even as someone who didn't really like Rooney's previous novel, Beautiful World, Where Are You? Okay, and one other book I enjoyed this year, which sort of makes sense given that I am doing this whole book discussion on YouTube thing, is a book that I read with Davut Gosley's reading group. I read several really interesting books with his reading group, and one that really stood out to me and just made me think differently about what I'm doing here. It's called Better Living Through Criticism: How to Think About Art, Pleasure, Beauty, and Truth. A.O. Scott is a critic for the New York Times. He was a film critic and I think still is a critic of some sorts. In this book that sets high ambitions in terms of what he's trying to figure out what he's doing as a critic and why he's doing it, but also really strives to remain down to earth and conversational in a way that lay readers like myself who are not well versed in literary and cultural criticism will be able to understand. This book really makes us think about what it is that we appreciate in literature, and not just literature, but film, music, and culture in general, and how we try to find objectivity there, how maybe there is objectivity relative to certain goalposts that we set. And yet, we all really love and appreciate and would defend some work of art out there that everyone around us would claim is completely trashy or garbage. Um, if you're interested at all in thinking about the topic of literary or cultural criticism, I think this is a decent place to start, that doesn't get into the academic world of this, but that just retains a very personal reflection on A.O. Scott's own experiences analyzing films for many years. So that's 2024, and it's always fun to remember just how many good things I read this year. If I really had it together, I might say a bit here about what I'm aspiring to read next year, but well, I do think it's a good thing to consider at some point so that I can make space for some of the bigger or tougher reads like War and Peace that are hard to fit in just, casually, but I haven't gotten there yet. So, in any case, what have you read? What are you aspiring to read in 2025? Leave me a note with your favorites or even your biggest disappointments, as it may be, and let me know where you're headed this year. And until next time, happy reading.